Senator Becker. Okay, guys, we are recording, and you will get a copy of the recording, by the way, everybody that's registered, and we will distribute it on YouTube. So let me tell you why we are so thrilled to have Senator Becker with us today to launch this informal series. He was elected in 2020. Senator Becker represents the 13th Senate District, which comprises most of San Mateo County and the northern part of Santa Clara County. He is the author of several state bills that focused on accelerating California's transition to 100% clean energy and net zero emissions, voter access and justice reforms, and leveraging technology to provide greater economic mobility for all Californians. If you visit his website, and it's going to be entered into chat, you'll see how much of his legislation relates directly to our league advocacy work. Senator Becker had in the state legislature 12 bills passed in the 21-22 session.
Area League.
Yes.
And Senator, that's a remarkable achievement. So we at the league want to acknowledge that. His topic today, of course, relates directly to our making democracy work, a priority for league at all levels. Climate change consistently ranks highest in our state program planning priorities. 3 of his 12 bills passed were major measures to combat climate change and part of the Senate Climate Working Group's climate package. One of those bills supported low-cost, equitable financing so more homeowners can afford to decarbonize their homes and buildings. I'm not going to take the time to describe all of the senator's legislation, and again, I urge you to visit his website. I do want to highlight 2 more bills. The League Bay Area Board recommended to our League State Legislation Committee that it support SB 917, authored by Senator Becker. That would have required the 27 transit agencies in the Bay Area to work together to develop an integrated fare structure, create a connected network plan, and develop a single transit map and wayfaring measures. While the bill failed, much of its suggested improvements are underway. The League Bay Area Board appreciates his effort to create a seamless, integrated, accessible transit system, and your League Bay Area Board is going to closely follow Metropolitan, Metropolitan Transportation Commission's work to implement seamless Bay Area principles. And of course, I've got one more bill that I definitely want to send some personal thanks to the senator on. The state league's housing and homelessness team selected SB 948 as one of 4 bills, housing related, for our league advocacy. Senator Becker authored this technical bill, which will repurpose tens of millions of dollars for affordable housing projects. It created a system-wide insurance policy to replace large reserves previously locked into individual affordable housing properties. It passed easily and is an example of the kind of practical legislation that inspires confidence in government. So, Senator, again, thank you. We are great admirers of your legislative work, and now I'm going to turn the program over to you so you can help us better understand how the league can support your efforts to fight voter cynicism and restore faith in government. So, Senator Becker, I turn the floor over to you now, and thank you again.
Well, wonderful to be here with all of you. Is the sound okay?
Yes, you're fine.
Great. Wonderful to be here with you, especially on such an important topic. There really is nothing more important to our democracy than inspiring faith and confidence and fighting voter cynicism. We've had a very rocky few years, as you all know, at the national level, and it led to a lot of fears of civil war, frankly. It led to polarization and fears that we were really at a breaking point. And while we still certainly have many issues, I think we can all be heartened by the midterm elections and elections.
Senator, we lost your sound for a little while. Let's see if it's okay now. You're pixelating a little bit.
Yeah, I saw that. Let's keep going. If I have to move to a laptop, I will. This is
Okay.
my desktop. So let me know if it. I saw that. That's what I was wondering. If it's an issue, let me know.
All right, I will. Thank you.
We'll try to switch. But anyway, I think we'd all be heartened by the midterm elections and the rejection of election deniers. And it let us all breathe a bit of a sigh of relief. But we know that we still have much more work to do if we are going to fight voter cynicism and if we're actually going to increase access to voting in this country rather than many states that are working to actually decrease voter access. What I've done specifically in these areas is a couple things. One, when I was elected, we found some research out of Stanford that some law students had done that showed that in California, in our March 2020 primary, we had 100,000 ballots rejected, 100,000 ballots rejected in California in the March 2020 primary. When we looked at that, one of the major reasons was signature verification, because now that we're voting by mail, we all have signatures, and some of those signatures maybe were based on something from 10, 20 years ago. And we found that particularly this was targeting elderly voters who are having difficulty here in terms of rejection of ballots, and disabled voters. And so we really looked into this and we found that we need to do a couple of things. Number one, we had to really change the presumption. So rather than trying to presume that they're invalid, have to feel beyond a reasonable doubt that they're valid, we changed the law. So registrars now, the presumption is that they are actually valid, and they have to believe beyond a reasonable doubt that they're invalid. It used to be reversed. They used to be presumption they were invalid, had to believe they were valid. We changed that presumption. The presumption is now they're valid. And we also increased the contacts. It used to be only a physical letter that they could mail to the homeowner, to the voter, and then try to get a physical mail back to indicate that it really was them. We changed that to allow for phone calls, for emails, and increased the outreach there. And so just by doing that, we're already seeing the number of rejections go down, and we hope that will now continue over time. Secondly, I passed a bill, as you know, many people coming out of the prison system, unfortunately, the quality of the data interaction between the registrars and CDCR was not good. So many people were not getting their voter rights restored. There's a lot of confusion if somebody was Jim Smith, a lot of confusion about are they, who are they, and are they the right person to now get voting rights restored. And so I passed a bill that requires now a weekly feed of data from CDCR to the registrars across the state, and that actually people are notified when they're released that you now are eligible to vote, you have your voting rights restored. I will note this year, working with Assemblyman Isaac Bryan, who's a rising star here in the legislature, on a bill that will actually allow people to vote in prison, allow inmates to vote. We took another step last year along these lines, which was to allow people now to register. We know where they're registered, not where the prison is located, but we know their last point of address. And so now we want to allow them to vote in that area, and we'll see if we pass that. But for now, I have this piece. And then another part of that bill, we allowed military and overseas voters to have the same day registration rights that now the broader California public has. So those are a few things we've done on voter access. And I appreciate the nice comments there. But, in terms of cynicism, that is, access alone, that's a start. By the way, I was on a Senate delegation on wildfires and climate to Australia and New Zealand, and those countries actually mandate voting. You get fined if you don't vote. And so that's not something we're on the docket here right now, but they have very high voting. I will just say that they have very high numbers of voters. But the other piece in voter cynicism in combating it is just inspiring confidence in our democracy. itself. And I think people are surprised when I tell them that in the level of vitriol and polarization in Sacramento is not what it is at the national level. And so we can kind of get that word out. It's actually quite cordial with our Republican colleagues. Here's a footnote for you. When people are termed out or they're not running again for another reason, they, on the Senate floor, they can pick two people to speak about them. And in almost all cases, people picked a Democrat and a Republican to speak about them. And in some cases, one of my Republican colleagues picked two Democrats and no Republicans to speak about him. And I thought that was really telling. And so that itself is a message we need to get. Not that we don't have our moments, but we need to get that message out. And then continue to communicate that government can work. We can tackle the issues of the day, whether it's homelessness, whether it's education, whether it's climate, that we can rally together and we can be strategic and thoughtful and effective and tackle these issues so people, again, have confidence that government is working. So number one, they want to see that polarization is going down, the vitriol. They want to see that people are focused on the work of the public and not just fighting each other. And then number two, they want to see that we are effective in doing this. So that's certainly what I'm trying to do. One of my classmates is doing civic health, and that's another entity I know, along with the league and others, who are working to combat polarization and increase dialogue across the area. And I just want to make one last plug. Gavin Newsom, our governor, created for the first time an Office of Volunteerism led by Josh Friday, who's terrific, someone I've known for a long time. And they're doing really amazing work, and they have a conservation corps as part of it, other things, and everything we can do to increase interactions, get people from urban areas into rural areas into urban areas. One of the best things I did for 15 years was serve on the board, the trustee board for the UC Merced Foundation. So I spent a lot of time then going there and spending time there and really understanding that area in a way I wouldn't have if I wasn't spending more time. So it's another thing we have to do. I want to leave time for questions, but I will speak on a few other issues that you asked me to look at. Number one, from the budget, I just had my first run through for my budget subcommittee, which is Budget Subcommittee 2. That's responsible for all climate, all water, all natural resources. And so it's something I'm very excited about. But it's also an area that was sort of hit hard and maybe hit harder by the budget cuts from the administration as they look to deal with their budget deficit. We have now a projected $25 billion deficit. And I would not be surprised if these deficits continue. We are very income tax dependent, as you know, in our state. So we're very dependent on IPOs and taxes on the wealthiest Californians, some of which are leaving, the state, and because they, it's a very significant savings for them to be in other places, and we have to be cognizant of that, and we have to really monitor the data and look at the impact that is all having on our budget. But the budget this year, the governor decided not to reach into the rainy day fund, which is an option, but to make cuts in some of these areas. And some of these areas are areas that we'd actually done massive appropriations. So he's really cutting some of our gains, so to speak. But they're still very significant when you think about programs. I was out planting trees at a school with canopy. And it turns out, I didn't realize this, that there's a $30 million appropriation for urban forestry that had been in the budget for a number of years that has now gotten cut out. I was talking to someone else today from Greenlining, which is great environmental justice work. And there was capacity grants to communities to get them really ready to apply for what we call TCC. This is Transitional Climate Communities. This is money that was specifically allocated by the legislature as part of our Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund money, part of our cap and trade money. But to access that, these cities then had these planning grants, and they felt this has been really critical, and that money's been cut out. So, I keep finding every day about little programs that have been cut out that are still very significant. And then, of course, things like coastal resilience, which got cut pretty significantly, which I'm fighting now to get back. but it's really a great experience for me to be now part of this budget subcommittee, and to really get a deeper dive into the budget process. You talked about 917. This is our Seamless Bay Area bill. As you mentioned, thank you, that we now have many of these our pieces of the bill are actually now being implemented by MTC. They can move forward with various pieces of the bill, but transit as a whole in the Bay Area is suffering now from a real crisis where we have ridership gone down with the pandemic, and that has affected things like Caltrain, which actually had a great fare box recovery, meaning that a higher percentage, 80% of the revenues came from their riders. They were affected then the most, consequently. And so we are now fighting for that, and partly to work on those issues and homelessness in a more strategic Bay Area way. I've actually now taken a more of a leadership role with the Bay Area Caucus itself. So I was just selected as vice chair of the Bay Area Caucus, which has become a really, under Phil Ting's leadership and Nancy Skinner's leadership, has really become quite a prominent and really important force to advocate for the Bay Area, but also for us all to come together as Bay Area legislators and work on the areas that I mentioned, on homelessness, on education, on transportation for sure. And so I look forward through that venue to continue to work on transportation policy and other things to really coordinate our Bay Area legislators around interim housing for the homeless, on permanent housing for the homeless, on mental health support, all of these things that many of us are thinking of and want to be better, coordinated on. Lastly, I'll mention on climate itself. You mentioned some of my legislation. This is an area where, some areas are harder to measure, some are easier to measure. This is very clear. We know, unfortunately, well, the reporting lags a little bit. Unfortunately, we're trying to get that reporting more sooner from the previous year, but we know we have roughly 425 million metric tons of CO2 that we emit, and we know we have to get to zero by 2045 because we passed a bill that finally codified that goal of net zero by 2045. We also passed my bill, by the way, which requires our state government to get to net zero by 2035. So that means all of our fleet, all of our buildings, all of our electricity by 2035. But anyway, we know we have to get to zero by 2045. We're currently reducing emissions around 1% a year. Overall, that's positive. We're going in the right direction. And it's significant that we reduce emissions by 20% over the last several years, and we've grown emissions, grown our economy, by 60%. So we've shown the rest of the country that we can reduce emissions and grow the economy. But right now we're reducing about 1% a year. That's not going to get us to where we need to be. We need to be reducing emissions about 5% a year. And so that requires a much more significant effort in all the major areas, transportation, which is 50%, buildings, which is 15%, our grid, which is 15%, agriculture, which is 8%, industrial, like cement and concrete. And so that's why my legislation works in all these areas. We said we have to work in each one of these areas. I have 8 bills this year, and I'm happy to talk about those. But we're able to pass bills in many of those areas over the last 2 years, and feel really good about that focus, because it's an area where we now must lead the country and really the world. We know we're not going to get a lot of legislation more out of Congress. The IRA was tremendous, but it's really carrots. There's no sticks to the IRA. It's really money to make things cheaper, which is great. But the regulatory policy still has been left to us. So I will look forward to also continue to address that through my new subcommittee, through continue to serve on the Energy and Utilities Committee, continue to serve on the Transportation Committee. So those are really some of my primary committees. I also serve on B&P, and it's called B&P, it's called Business Professions, but really the full title is Business Professions and Economic Development. So it's really the only place in the state Senate to do economic development work. And that's been a priority of mine. I served on the State Workforce Board for many years. And we have to continue to think about raising incomes. I had a really interesting conversation, which I mentioned yesterday, with someone from Golden State Opportunity. They really advocate on the EITC, which is kind of sounds wonky, but the earned income tax credit is probably the best anti-poverty program that we have. But really what she was saying was that really everyone should be making $75,000. I mean, that's really the level to live across our state, to really afford housing, all these things, $75,000. Well, obviously not everyone's at $75,000. So we have to continue to think of ways to raise both the minimum wage, and then use things like the earned income tax credit, housing subsidies, other things to close that gap. Otherwise, it's not a surprise why we have some of the issues that we have here today. So that's just maybe a different way to think about it, but it really kind of resonated with me. So I wanted to share it with all of you here. So with that, we'll look forward to having the questions and a dialogue here.
Thank you very much, Senator. And I'll be in touch with your office because we'd like to learn more about the work of the Bay Area Caucus and use some of our e-blast and monitor communication tools to get that information out there and follow up on some of your committee work. And just remind everybody that our email address is lwvbayarea@gmail.com. So please provide feedback directly to us on if you'd like to follow up on any of the information that Senator Becker presented. And we have a number of questions, so we're going to submit it in advance. So we'll do the best we can to get through them. First, I want to start with Dan Salas. Dan, you should be able to unmute yourself now because you're admitted as a co-host. Dan is hi, Dan. Dan's a former member of the Palo Alto League. He had the gall to move to Utah. However, he is a very active part of the state climate change efforts. And I also want to note that you have in the audience, you have Diz Swift. Diz Swift heads up in California the climate change interest group and is also very involved nationally. So I want you to know you're preaching to the choir. So Dan, would you like to ask two questions now? And Dan, I want to thank you for helping us launch this series and make the initial connection with Senator Becker. So go ahead, Dan.
Thank you, Roma. Nice to see you all again. Here I am in Salt Lake City and in my new habitat, and just am now a member of the Salt Lake League and going to look at Utah issues, environmental issues, So, what I wanted to say, Senator Becker, is so to increase respect for public officials, I think people need to understand better the challenges they face, and certainly, I think it's daunting the amount of issues that you just kind of described that you've been involved in, and the dedication I can see and the passion is just amazing, worthy of respect. But I have a few questions that around building that greater understanding about what you go through. And these are just very general questions. So one is can you name an issue that you faced in the Senate that's particularly gnarly because finding a policy solution to the problem is difficult? And then I have another one, the same kind of question, a parallel question, but something that's particularly gnarly because there are conflicting constituencies who are equally passionate but opposed to each other. So if you could, or maybe that's the same issue, but if you could talk about that, that would be great.
Yeah, so I got the second part, the issue with these kind of opposing constituencies. And then what was the first part of it again?
The first one was a particularly gnarly issue that's gnarly because finding a policy solution to the problem that, like the problem being like homelessness or, climate change is particularly difficult.
Yeah. Well, I'd say, yeah. So homelessness is a good example. The first one, I do think there are some innovations now, innovative ideas like interim supportive housing that we need to support. But it is multidimensional. It has been vexing in the sense that we've put so much money and gotten a lot of people off the streets, but the perception is it's not better, and perception is it's not better. And so that is certainly an example of an issue that's, and it's hard because, some people, feel, we know there's say 20 to 40% of the homeless that has serious mental illness, and there's more people that want to do more to help those people and maybe force them into treatment. And other people, the civil liberty groups are usually our allies, like ACLU, and these groups don't want us to do anything there. So, I mean, that's an example in both those areas of I'd say, a very tough issue. And then, in one of those opposing constituencies, certainly housing in the Bay Area is very controversial. And, you have a lot of people pushing for housing. We certainly need more housing. And then you have people, who say in my area, I lived here for 40 years. I was here before Google and Facebook and before they brought tens of thousands of employees. Why do I have to, why does this have to affect my quality of life to build something large next to me? And so that's a particularly tough issue.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you very much, Dan. And I want to just mention to all of you that your Bay Area board is working very hard to find out the kinds of issues, regional agencies that we can help educate our 20 local leagues on. And Senator, like I said, you are perfect to start off this series. And now if I could just ask you to go back to really league's wheelhouse and related to voter cynicism. Is there anything you're working on You mentioned some bills. Are you working on anything right now to improve voter access, or is there something you want to highlight for us today?
Yeah, specifically there'll be a bill, and I'll be more of a principal co-author of this effort, but it's, to mention a couple things. One, two things. Sometimes that, you have an idea and then it turns out someone's working on it, so you work with them. Maybe you lead, they lead, but there's two things I want to mention. One is revamping our motor voter program. And this is fun. This is actually something I got my start working on motor voter back in 1989 in Massachusetts. So it's kind of particularly resonates with me. But right now we give you the opt-in when you get your driver's license, opt into voting. And we actually want to make it more of an opt-out, right? That you will be registered unless for some reason you decide not to. And so that would be significant in other reforms to motor voter, number one. Number two, I think it's relevant, is that there's been a lot of concern. I've had others around misuse of the ballot measures, and where we pass things here in the legislature and companies pay someone $5, $6, $7 a signature to gather signatures to get something on the ballot, and it's worth it to them financially. People don't realize this, but once enough signatures are gathered, then that measure is frozen until the ballot. So if you think, why did the cigarette companies spend money gathering signatures, put something on the ballot that they knew would probably lose to around flavored nicotine or whatever flavored tobacco? Well, they got 2 more years of profits out of it. So it was a financial decision for them. And same thing for the fast food companies now that are fighting our fast food worker council, which was a really innovative solution, I believe, to wages and conditions in the fast food space. I was vote 21 for that. We only got 21 votes. We need 21 votes in that. And so it was very controversial. Now they put it on the ballot and they use misleading. We've heard many reports of the signature gathers being misleading. So we have a package that we're working on this year around registration. Right now there's nothing. Arizona, those signature gatherers have to register if you're a paid signature gatherer. Right now we don't. So we're working on other things around that.
Thank you, Senator. Just as a follow-up, voter misinformation, disinformation that you touched on is something that League at all levels is thinking about. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on really the best way to combat that, either regionally, statewide, nationally. In particular, do you think more money is the solution?
I'm sorry, more money for what specifically?
More money towards, for example, towards CBOs or registrars of voters, or just, I think we're all grappling with what is the most cost-effective way to help voters get accurate information.
Yeah, it's a good question. I'll look to the, I'd like to look to the league for guidance on this, in the coming years, because it's not something we're going to solve, this one year. But I do think it's important. I do think that, when people vote for home, more people actually read the pamphlet. And I think that's important, as one source. But yeah, I mean, I think, obviously, certainly anything we can do, and funding that we can secure for that kind of outreach and education is important. But I do want to mention, I think particularly starting with young people, getting them registered, getting them voting, and thinking about voting while they're in school. I remember years ago, someone I knew had funded a big study of why young people don't vote, and it was surprising. You think it's just, they're apathetic, but no, actually, what came out, the number one reason is because they didn't feel qualified. They didn't feel they had enough information. And so if we can get them in the habit of voting, say, hey, you know what, here's the information, you have enough, as much as anyone else, your opinion matters. I think that'll be helpful.
Thank you.
May I?
I'm going to call on Kathleen Cha, who will become League Bay Area president in July. So Kathleen, go ahead.
Well, I'm looking at the chat and some of the questions, and one that came up is an interesting variation. You were talking about registering voters in prison. This one is down into a different, it says, do you think that registered felons in California who've been charged with embezzlement should be able to run for office in California? You can be convicted of embezzlement and run for federal office. This is a loophole for charged felons. It's an interesting variation. I just wondered if that had come up in any of your discussions or looking at registering voters. Yeah,
it's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that as the question is, then you get, well, this person can't run and this person can't run, why embezzlement versus, 10 other crimes. So it's worth thinking about. I mean, embezzlement is people sometimes think about it as a victimless crime, but it's a heinous crime in its own way. It can really be debilitating to organizations, to companies, to governments. So it's worth looking at. But I think that's the question is where do you draw the line?
Right. And I wanted to ask you, Roma, we have one, Pat Willard, who would like to be able to ask her question live, and this has to do with environmental justice.
Thank you, Kathleen. I saw that, and I was going to ask Sherry if we can unmute Pat. And Pat, I will note that the poster right behind me is a map of sea level rise in the Bay Area. So obviously I am interested in your question. So Pat, if we can unmute you, I'll let you ask that question directly of the senator.
Okay, thank you. My question regarding environmental justice is that a number of Bay Shore communities, such as Redwood City, where I am, East Palo Alto, Bellhaven, and those areas that are on the just before going on to Dumbarton Bridge. There are a lot of Cargill salt ponds that are no longer in use, and this creates an issue in terms of what restoration to marshland would be able to do that creates good things for the entire of the Bay Area. And that is the ability that marshlands have in being able to further clean up wastewater that the plants don't have equipment to filter. And this was the cause of the huge algae plumes that we had last summer all over the Bay Area. And so that's sort of my concern with environmental justice. And you had mentioned that some funding had been cut and this and that. And these restoration efforts are taking place sometimes just by volunteers. And it seems like the state is lacking in what I'll call to getting on with it and getting it done. I don't know, one organization working with EPA, I don't know, took 5 years worth of planning, which to me, is way too long in making a plan for something, let alone getting it going.
Hey,
Yeah, sea level rise, big concern for me. Again, coastal resilience was cut more significantly in the budget than anything else. And so that's a big priority of mine to restore that. I was talking yesterday with Tasha Berta Horvath. She's chaired the select committee on sea level rise. But right now with my budget subcommittee, we're really well positioned to address these issues. Certainly, the low-income communities are often much more at risk. I spent time in Redwood City with at the mobile home park there that was flooded in the last big floods. Also East Palo Alto, of course, there was some significant flooding that could have been avoided. And anything we can do on preparing for that and working with One Shoreline, again, that's something the Bay Area Caucus can play, I believe, a big role in. I brought Len Masterman last year to the Bay Area Caucus to talk exactly about this, but restoring that marshland, all that work, it's all doable. It takes money, and we need to fund it and prioritize it. That's what I believe.
Thank you. And you mentioned your committees, and you sit on some very important committees. For us today, we're wondering if you might talk a little bit about some of the budget committees and the role they play. As I said, we were all surprised SB 917 died such a sudden death in appropriations. So some of that is a mystery to us. And I think I don't want to call out favorites here, but the Senate subcommittee on the clean energy future, I think, is one that's of overwhelming interest to a lot of our members.
Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah, really excited for the committees this year, but appropriations is the one part that can be mystery to us as well, unfortunately. It's the one area of some mystery. On that particularly, we did hear there was one particular agency in the East Bay that had an issue with it, and that's really what killed it, unfortunately. But we're not bringing back this year because right now the focus is just on funding for all transit, just to try to keep transit alive here, which is so critical to so many. So that's a big priority. But yeah, being part of the budget committee, what's great, Nancy Skinner has done a great job in doing oversight hearings. We already had a whole 3-hour oversight hearing on housing and homelessness spending. We had a 3-hour oversight hearing on Monday on childcare and childcare spending, childcare in general in California, and had some great big takeaways there. So being on the budget committees and being able to do that kind of oversight is really tremendous. I won't be doing my subcommittee again this year on energy, on the energy committee, because I'll be doing a lot of that work now through the subcommittee, through my budget subcommittee, and so that'll be really the focus, along with my bills and the main energy committee on the climate space. And it's going to be a big year, I think. Oh, you're muted now.
Thank you, Senator. We look forward to watching the session progress. And of course, that is the state board that takes action on all state legislation. If it's a bill like 917, then we as a Bay Area request the state to take action.
Okay, great.
And I know you're very aware of LEAG, and on your schedule this afternoon, you have the annual legislative interviews that we do. And so thank you very much for taking your time to meet directly with your leagues, because it's very vital to us. So I'm not going to get to all the questions because we want to keep you on time, but I do want to ask one question. You mentioned housing and homelessness. Many of us have had family move out of the Bay Area because they can't afford to stay here. So this is a general question. It says, how do we cut emissions without increasing the number of homeless? Because many carbon reduction strategies increase the cost of housing and transportation. So would you like to unpack that one for us a little bit?
Yeah, so you're saying, how do we address climate without raising the cost of too much and actually increasing homelessness? Is that right?
Yes, exactly. In other words, if as the cost of housing and renting, of course, goes up, particularly here in Silicon Valley, where we're from, we're really seeing that. I live in the city of San Jose, and it's we've had a dramatic increase, I'm sure you're aware of, in homelessness.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, I mean, it's certainly our hope, and this is my conversation with Alvaro from Greenlining today. It's certainly my hope that our climate policies can decrease economic inequality rather than increase economic inequality. And one of the parts of that is actually just making homes more livable. As you know, in the Bay Area, or certainly where I live, when I first moved there 20 years ago, we didn't need air conditioning, or 25 years originally, and then 20 were in my current home. And then we had, you know, one wall unit in my daughter's room facing the sun, and then one wall room downstairs. Then we got a mobile unit for our room because it just got too oppressive over the years, and then one other mobile unit for my son's. So now we need air conditioning in many communities in the Bay Area, and we know that if you get a heat pump, electric heat pump, to replace your gas furnace, you also get air conditioning with that. And so some of our programs to electrify homes will also make them more livable places. And they should also decrease costs. We won't be subject to the volatile nature of natural gas. Now, unfortunately, our electrical rates are also really high, so we're not quite seeing that benefit. And that's another whole complicated story, because we throw a lot of things into rates, all the wildfire costs. Other costs are why our rates, you know, it's 10 to 12 cents a kilowatt hour to really produce the electricity and move it around. But our rates are closer to 35, 36, 37 cents an hour, 45 cents an hour during peak. So so you know, there's a lot of sort of pieces to that, but I'm hopeful that we can address climate and actually decrease inequality rather than increase it. But we do have to you know, look at the cost of housing. But one of the questions I ask myself is, if we've actually lost population here in the Bay Area, or maybe we're even over 10, 15 years, why has the cost of housing increased so dramatically? I still don't really fully know the answer to that. I'm trying to look into that. Is that people are buying second homes and vacation homes and investment homes and not living in them, or what? Why has that happened? So there's lots of things we need to look at with the cost of housing. Obviously, you know, materials has gone up, the labor costs, all of that, and that's why I guess I just want to just make overall plea. I mean, there is a belief, yes, we just keep building more and that'll bring down the costs, and there's reason to believe that will happen over time. But we really just do need to focus on affordable housing that will be affordable, that is subsidized housing, and know we're going to have to subsidize it. And then we have to figure out as a state how we're going to do that. We used to have redevelopment dollars, and some of that dollars was misspent, but some of that would go to affordable housing that we don't have anymore. And so we have to look as a state to not just say to communities, you have to build, you have to build. We have to provide money for subsidized affordable housing.
Well, thank you for mentioning redevelopment. The city of San Jose, along with Los Angeles, were the two largest redevelopment agencies in the state for a couple of decades. And I've seen a figure as high as $1 billion a year that used to go into the affordable housing because there was a set aside required by redevelopment. And that money disappeared. So I think that's, again, a big impact. And again, I want to acknowledge your time. We're only going to get probably about 2 or 3 more questions in. Kathleen, I want to go back to you. You have a question entered into chat, so I want to give you the opportunity to ask that question. And there you go.
What I was looking at the concept of the reduction of carbon emissions, and we talked about what contributes to it. Transportation, building. When it comes to building, were you referring to building of commercial buildings? Are they the key problem in terms of causing emissions, or were you also talking about housing? And are we talking about maybe better building standards? I just wanted you just to elaborate a little bit more on that.
Yes, I have a bill this year on building standards. Yeah. If we have proper benchmarking, then we know, and we should know, for a certain size building, for a 100,000 square foot commercial building in this area, we should know how much energy it should be using, and how much water it should be using. And we also know what it is actually using. And so once we have that information, then we can do benchmarking, and we can say, you have to, if this is what the average building, you have to get there. Over time, we'll give you a few years to get there. And if not, there's going to be penalties. So that's the legislation that I'm doing this year around larger buildings, to answer your questions, around performance standards. And actually, for the first time ever, expanding that to water as well, because water should be subject to the same thought process. So that is one of the big bills. I started it last year in a way to just socialize it with environmental justice groups, to the point that was raised earlier for the last question. Environmental justice groups are concerned, appropriately so, on the cost of housing. So we want to make sure that when we do these bills, we don't, raise the cost of housing too much, or make things unaffordable. So it's really been a 2-year process, but this will be our big push this year. And in fact, we have to pass something. The California joined the Building Performance Standards Coalition, which the White House started, and really to fulfill our obligations in that, we really do need to pass something this year. But it's complicated. We're going to have it's going to be a big bill, a lot of fights around it.
Interesting. Thank you very much, Kathleen. I see a question that's come in that again relates to, League's wheelhouse on election processes. Is California too reliant on propositions? Can we really expect ourselves and others to understand the complex financial repercussions of any of them? We may have to vote for things we care about, but really don't know how that impacts the whole budget and debt of the state. Would you like to respond to that? It relates to, you've already answered it a little bit, but this one raises few more interesting points. If you could talk a little bit more about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say we have the system we have, so I don't see us, totally getting rid of ballot measures. It would probably take a constitutional measure to do that, which is a long process. So, but at the same time, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, I do believe that there have been abuses, and I mentioned specifically the flavored tobacco, or this year, my colleagues Monique Limon and Lena Gonzalez, they passed very courageously a bill for the first time on setbacks for fracking for new wells, and industry is challenging that. That's on the ballot now. The fast food worker, they're challenging that. That's on the ballot now. And so there have been abuses, and I think voters often do the right thing, actually, but it's not always easy for them to do the right thing if there's a lot of misinformation. So we need to focus on a number of pieces of that. A couple of things. Number one, last year we passed the Disclose Act. This is really the third dimension of the Disclose Act, as I'm sure you all know with the League. And this will require the top 3 supporters of each side to be listed there. And I don't know exactly when that takes into effect, but the idea is if somebody sees the League, or sees if you can do such a thing, or sees Sierra Club, then they may say, oh, okay, I get it. And if they see League for, puppies and babies on the other side, they might, it might sound good, but they may wonder what that really is, So that's one thing we've done. And then I mentioned the measure we're working on this year around signature gatherers and trying to work on that process. So I think we have the system we have. The question is very important, but right now we just have to work on improving the system that we have.
Thank you, Senator. And again, we realize you have a hard stop and we want to keep you on time. So to close out, I wonder if you'd just like to offer some general comments on what you see the legislature prioritizing for this year, and just some general thoughts on what you recommend that we watch.
I was looking through the questions, but for the upcoming year, things to watch.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, on climate, I want to mention, I have an op-ed on this in Mercury News. You could look for it. But,
yes.
But Mary Creasman runs Environmental Voters. She said this was last year was the most impactful year we've ever had for climate legislation. So that was tremendous. But we can't rest on that, obviously, and we need to focus on now a lot of the execution pieces. Now we've really done the goal setting. There's one bill that would goal set a little bit more, but now it's execution and all of the other wonky areas of interconnection, of transmission. I have a bill around solar canopies on the millions of acres of parking lots. That's wasted space. Let's put solar on top of that. We can't even build out enough solar without taking away farmland. Otherwise, taking away farmland or sensitive habitats in the desert. So let's take advantage of that canopy. And also it will look at right-of-ways, as a number of other states have done, solar and transmission along the right-of-ways of highways. So, we'll have a bill on that. We'll have a bill on cow burps, which is a major source. When I was in New Zealand, 50% of their emissions are from agriculture because they're so agriculture dependent. But most of that is from livestock, and we're about 8%. So that's an area that we have to tackle. So we got to look at all these pieces, and happy to go through that. I think in a criminal justice sense, we've made a lot of gains the last few years, but I have a big parole reform bill that we'll work on, which is one big piece. We have 30,000 inmates serving life sentences. Texas has 10,000, and we're only 25% bigger. So we still do have an over incarceration issue. And we'll continue to press ahead on that. But in other areas, it's really going to be looking to see if we can keep our gains while, despite tough budget times, can we continue to decrease inequality? One issue I just in my journal memory today, very emotional one for the 7 farm workers who were killed in Half Moon Bay, and we can adjourn the Senate, in honor of somebody or a group, and I mentioned the fact that this revealed the inadequacies in farm worker housing, and so even it's a tough budget year, we have to address farm worker housing. So these are all the pieces from the budget that we could need to continue to do. And then I'd say, lastly, to kind of full circle, bring back to where we started. I think there's no reason it's going to be interesting years. We sort of, in some sense, January 6th and those horrible moments are more in the rearview mirror. On the other hand, we have, without to be too political, Donald Trump now gearing up another re-election, campaign. And so, so on the one hand, we're getting less polarized, but we could get more polarized. So I think it's going to be an important year for voter confidence and to fight voter cynicism and to try to keep our country and our region together.
Well, Senator, we want to thank you very much for being a leader on so many issues that are important to the League of Women Voters. We want to thank you very much for your time today. I know it's a hectic time in Sacramento. I think you've got a bill deadline. So we really are grateful for your time, and again, for kicking off this informal series to help us get more acquainted with our state legislators. So I want to thank you very, very sincerely. And we'll look forward to talking with you again. And I'd like to be in communication with your staff to get more information on some of these things. And we'd like to help push out and fulfill our role in voter education. So with that, I will say goodbye to the senator, and goodbye and thank you to all those attending. And again, remember, we will be pushing out a recording of this information. It will go on our YouTube channel, and please do share it, particularly those of you that are in other league interest groups. So thank you all very much.
Thanks for the work that all of you do.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.